And I'm so, so thrilled to be in conversation with Emily Johnston. Um, Emily is, she's the communications director of 350 Seattle and a writer, poet, and activist. Emily was also one of the valve turners who shut down the tar sands crude oil pipelines into the United States one day in 2016. And her absolutely beautiful essay, Loving a Vanishing World, inspired this installation that I'm in now, The Garden. So today is the final conversation and that I'm hosting in The Garden. So the project is ending as it began, with Emily Johnston's heartrending and inspired words. When preparing for this conversation, I revisited her essay, and I was astounded again at how much wisdom, love, heartbreak, and vision are held in those pages. And I realized how much the essay shaped not only my art and activism, but also my inner landscape and my emotions. How the essay both reflected back to me the grief that I had been feeling, loving a vanishing world, and also how it expanded and deepened my experience of that grief, catalyzing it into something more meaningful and allowing a sense of sacred purpose to open up and find space within me. The shape of the installation is one of a passageway, portal, or birth canal. And the idea for this form is based on this passage from Emily's essay. Quote, "When we think about accelerating extinction, it's like looking at the terrifying narrows of an hourglass where only a few will slide through. So sometimes I imagine myself instead on the far side of something more like an ecological birth canal. How many of Earth's beauties can we help to survive the passage into the next era? Is each one not a gift we can safeguard to the world by our actions?" And then there are Emily's soul-stirring calls to action that have completely upended my own life and made it impossible to continue on my path as a commercial artist. I can't do it anymore. There is so much pressing and beautiful work to be done. She writes, quote, "If you can, then the world needs you, and it needs you right now, because anything that we do this year or next year is worth 10 of the same thing 10 years from now. Nothing has ever been more important than holding the world well back from any of the ecological tipping points that we haven't yet crossed. And some are perilously close. This makes us, however unintuitively, the most powerful people who have ever lived. We have been granted an astonishingly beautiful gift that has never before been given to humans, the chance to shepherd human and animal life into the coming centuries and millennia when we know that much of it would otherwise disappear." And she also urges us not to fall into paralyzed grief. She writes, quote, "Despair is an accurate reflection of the peril we face, but it isn't a predictor of the future. It's devastatingly nearsighted. To see beyond what despair sees, to move from the feeling towards the possibility, calls for things that we have in abundance, love, imagination, and a willingness to simply tend the world as best we can without a guarantee of success." And finally, I'll say that becoming involved in the climate movement has led, for myself, to a spiritual deepening and sort of tectonic shifts in the way that I connect with the living earth, with myself, and with my community. And Emily writes in her essay, quote, "Loving this vanishing world feels like a kind of prayer sometimes." And I find this to be true. It's a heartrending and expansive prayer, and one that connects us to stretches of time and geography in life far beyond ourselves. So with so much gratitude, Emily, welcome to the garden.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's really humbling to hear you say all that. You know, yeah, knowing how the essay, affected some people, just really, it was a very difficult essay to write, and obviously it makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I had tears streaming down my face as I was preparing for this conversation. It was a very, I mean, the whole book was such a beautiful journey, but Your essay was for me really a turning point. So thank you so much for it. So my first question is that I'm curious to hear about your upbringing and what early memories awakened your love of nature.
Well, I am the youngest of 7 children, and I grew up outside of Boston. I think, my family's full of passionate, argumentative, smart people. And, but I was also, as the baby and significantly younger than any of the rest of them. So I'm almost 6 years younger than my next up sister. I was also spoiled by my siblings quite a lot. It's funny, people ask, I remember I had a radio interviewer ask me once after the valve turning action. He was basically poking around for some childhood trauma that would make me open to doing something like that, or some dramatic experience. And I was just like, no, I was just like every other sort of sensitive, animal loving kid, and I was shy, and I identified very deeply with animals, and still do. And and loved nature, connected to nature, which for me was, the pond near my house, my backyard. And then I grew up spending summers on Cape Cod, and I completely fell in love with the landscape there. So yeah, that was an era when kids were allowed to sort of run wild a lot more, right? And running wild was a great thing for me. I was often sort of solitary and just kicking around, on the beach or on the trails or whatever. And I think that just gave me an appreciation of the world around me in a way that kids sometimes don't get the chance to, I think, but nothing, sort of dramatic.
Okay, that's so funny. I wasn't expecting a dramatic. I love that the journalist thought that there was a dramatic answer. Just from my own experiences and the answers I've gotten from asking different people in the garden, I feel like the moments where you awaken to the beauty of nature and to your place within nature are often really subtle, quiet moments of sort of silence and reflection and feeling at one with the natural world and feeling a kinship and empathy. So maybe the journalist hadn't had one of those yet.
Yeah. Oh God, that sounds like a terrible life. When you say that, one thing memory it triggers is just one awareness. When I was a kid, when I was like 10, I was never a very athletic kid, and I was like bad at sports and stuff. And but I always did really love running. And there was just a moment I remember when I felt so in my body, but I was old enough, like I said, maybe 9 or 10 or something, to be aware that that wasn't how I always felt, and to be particularly conscious of it. And I think that moment for me in my sort of animal self was, sort of part of a skein of things that yeah, have an impact on the way that I view the world and myself, my place in it.
Yeah, I love that. I used to do a lot of running in California, and so meditative. I can definitely relate to that sort of disappearing of the self that's so wonderful when you're running. So the next question that I wanted to ask you about is that we all have unique moments to waking up to the crisis of the planetary crisis, kind of moments where the facts and figures go beyond the page and all of a sudden it's a very embodied knowing. And I was wondering if you could tell us about the experiences that awakened you to the planetary crisis and how these experiences inform your work.
For me, again, it was very subtle, because my connection to nature meant just that I sort of read and paid attention to things in a way that, maybe I wouldn't have otherwise, or maybe some folks don't. My elder brother, I think, gave me a copy, or maybe just recommended the End of Nature when it came out in 1989. And that had a really profound impact on me. And I've since joked with Bill, who's become a friend, that he sort of ruined my sleep ever thereafter. I think that book had that effect on a lot of people. And so after that, like, I just was, I read everything that I could see, which in the mainstream press was not that much, of course, but on climate change as the science developed. and got increasingly alarmed, but I had sort of no sense of what to do with that alarm because there was no such thing as a climate movement or anything like it in those days. And I wasn't a scientist or a politician, you know? So yeah, so it was the visceral awareness was something that was always there. And I think the reason it was always there also after End of Nature in particular is simply that fit with what I understood of the world, you know, the ways in which humans can be quite foolish and quite self-destructive and destructive of others as well. Just there was something about it that just, yeah, it represented instincts that I had had. It made explicit instincts that I had had for a long time. And so as the evidence mounted, of course, that only deepened my concern and my certainty that this was you know, the biggest problem that, by a large measure, that humans had ever faced. Yeah, and you know, and then the only other thing I would say that sort of was a big shift for me was when McKibben and 350.org asked folks to come to the White House to get arrested about KXL, because I, you know, I had very little faith in that as a sort of precursor to change. I didn't understand, you know, movements really at that point in time, and it felt like sort of, you know, quixotic, and I thought it may be, you know, self-indulgent, and I really sort of wrestled with whether to go, and you know, I ended up doing it more or less because I knew that nothing else I was doing that week was going to have any impact on the climate crisis, and so if there was any possibility at all that this was going to, then it was incumbent upon me to do it, you know, and to trust the wisdom of other people who thought this might make a difference, you know. So
yeah, and probably also connecting with community was, I find that to be really a balm upon me.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah, and even
Mm.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, no, you go on and then I'll say my thought.
I was going to say, yeah, for me, connecting with community, even in the reading I was doing, you know, so even reading, you know, Bill's book and others and articles, and then eventually the Elizabeth, you know, Colbert book, The Sixth Extinction. And so even to understand that there were people in the world who saw exactly what I saw and were more capable of doing something about it in a way that was obvious to me, you know, just to know, yeah, just to sort of have that intellectual and psychological company, even before I knew any of these folks, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was,
that's what I felt about reading the book that you contributed to, All We Can Save. It was all of a sudden I had a community that I felt welcomed in, even though it was off the pages of a book, right? Yeah, that I can really relate to that. And the thing that I was just about to, that I started to say is that my uncle recently, because I do collage work, he recently found all of these Auburn bird calendar prints that my grandparents had from
wow.
ages ago. I mean, before they were married even, I think, or maybe when they first got married before they had kids. So they're from the 1940s and 50s. And they hadn't been opened since I got this amazing package in Berlin. And I was really overcome by emotion because it smelled like my grandparents' house, and they both passed away. So it was quite wonderful. The prints are beautiful, but something that really struck me is that they were gifts from an insurance company, basically. Like it was sort of like a once in a year thank you. I mean, absolutely beautiful. I've never gotten anything so amazing from an insurance company. But they came with a booklet, and I just kind of by chance picked it up and started reading it. And it was such an impassioned text about birds and how quickly they're going extinct, and the land use crisis. And it was just interesting sort of peering back in time. I mean, if the author had known what the world looks like now, I mean, I think he could see the direction it was going in. But it was just interesting. It was really this time capsule, this untouched time capsule. And I opened it up, and it was this really passionate voice of a conservationist from way back. And I don't know, it really touched me and saddened me.
Absolutely. Reading Aldo Leopold or Rachel Carson, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
people have understood for a long time, you know, so.
Yeah. So I am personally just in awe of your activism, and I hope that I one day find that sort of force of nature inside of me that will propel me to greater acts of courage. And I'm curious, you said that you're introverted. I'm also introverted, and that activism did not come naturally to you. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk me through your journey, and when did you feel like you had found your place in the climate movement?
It took quite a while. So I went to the KXL election at the White House, and then over the course of the next like year and a half, there was somebody, 350.org asked people after that event, those who had been involved in it, to go back to their own cities and connect with their own like friends and neighbors and other people who had also been to DC for it, and start to cook up things locally, right? Which was a really smart thing to do. And so I met a guy who became a friend and with whom I did a couple of very, very quixotic, not, utterly impact-free actions here in Seattle. But we were both committed to sort of continuing to think about this and seeing what we could do and just showing up by having a sense of humility around what we knew and whether things could be effective even if we didn't understand, kind of thing. And he knew somebody, about a year and a half later, who wanted to start a 350 local chapter. And she had talked to him and like 5 other people, and he brought me in, and so we did. I would say in that first year and a half or so, we were finding our feet. None of us were organizers. We really had no idea what the hell we were doing, honestly. There was one young man who joined us sometimes who did. He had some organizing experience, but that was it. The rest of us were just sort of groping blindly and trying to keep showing up. But there were enough people in the area who were concerned and who heard about us and who would show up that it started to gather some momentum. And then in my view, the thing that changed everything for our group, and also absolutely from my understanding at a minimum, was when Shell, when the Port of Seattle, which is publicly elected, announced that Shell was going to be hosting its Arctic drilling rigs at our port. The Port of Seattle loves to think of itself as really green. So does the city of Seattle. We make all kinds of really pretty statements about what we're going to do on climate change and then fail every time. And so a bunch of us started showing up really regularly at the Port Commission meetings, basically saying, this is business as usual, it has to stop. Oh, and also just 2 days after they announced that, or maybe even the next day, the journal Nature did an article on what projects that we could not engage in and still hope to stave off, catastrophe, semi-permanent catastrophe. And Arctic drilling was one of those things. And so here, scientists are telling us this is a project that basically represents the end of civilization. And the Port of Seattle commissioners are all like, well, if we don't host them, somebody else will, And so, it was just so outrageous, and enough people understood, that it was that outrageous, that we were able to, with a lot of help from the folks at Greenpeace and other bigger organizations that sent like 1 or 2 staff members into Seattle to sort of help us organize and help us figure things out. We were able to kick up quite a fuss. And, you may have even seen the pictures of the kayaks swarming the Arctic drilling rigs in Elliott Bay. And those pictures made it on front pages across the world, and the rigs still left. We delayed them by all of about a half an hour, but we did cause quite a bit of bad press for them. And then folks in Seattle staved them off for a day and a half by hanging off a bridge, in another really beautiful action. They were keeping one of the associated boats from leaving, and it was necessary for them to start drilling and all this. And so when they didn't find as much as they hoped, and they'd already put in, I think it was $4 billion at that point into the project, rather than continuing, which was completely what we assumed they would do, they gave up the following fall. And they said, one of the board members even told somebody, told a writer for The Guardian, that yes, they were disappointed by how little they'd found, but also they were acutely aware of the risks to their reputation. And so it was clear at that point that what we had done had really, really mattered. And it also brought in tons of people. And for me, one of the important things also sort of psychologically was, in addition to being introverted, I also was just, I don't know, I was one of those, a weakness that I've had that I think a lot of people have is that I tend to gravitate to things I'm good at. And when I was a kid in school, like I was really good at school, you know what I mean? And so like I would just keep doing the things I was good at rather than taking a risk and doing things I didn't understand or I wasn't naturally good at, and this was the first time in my life, doing, helping to start the 350 local chapter was the first time I'd really been able to sort of show up regularly for something that I didn't know how it worked. I didn't really have any faith that it would work, but it just felt sort of morally critical that I keep doing it, because I didn't know what else to do, and it was clear something had to be done. And when those young organizers came in from other organizations for Shall Know, there was a moment at which, I clearly, because like there was all of a sudden lots of interest, there was lots of stuff going on, lots of people coming in, things were moving really fast. And I understood that I could like be a little freaked out by that because things were no longer sort of confined to our small group, and were largely being moved forward by people I didn't know who were notably younger than me and very skilled at this stuff. And I sort of, and I was feeling a little prickly about that, and I saw my friend feeling very prickly about that. He was, the idea of, us at what were we then? He's the same age as I am. At 47 or something, 40, sort of being bossed around in a very nice way by a bunch of like 30-year-old women, yeah. And I saw him sort of having a hard time with that, and so the little part of me that also was having a hard time with that is just like, no, I'm not going to be that person, and I'm going to just sort of run with this and be grateful that these people who know what they are doing, and I'm going to do my best to learn from them as best I can, and so for me, and because I also just really liked and admired them, that was when I started to feel like I really had a community. I mean, I'd had the one friend before and I'd liked other people for sure. There are lots of people that I liked, but that was when it started to sort of cohere for me, in people that I liked and trusted, or loved and trusted, and trusted their judgment too, and was willing to sit in difficult spaces with them and figure out difficult things and move forward even when we had disagreements and so forth.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I love this. A concept or a theme that's come up over and over and over again in these conversations, and just for myself this year, has been this idea of collaboration over competition. And I think that it's also new for me, right? I think we're trained from birth to compete against each other, and the idea of collaborating and having a common goal and living with integrity and working towards that goal is actually quite radical and new. And I'm really glad that I have discovered it. And that's funny that you said that prickly feeling. I have this new thing that I do now. When I feel that prickly feeling, I sit with it. I'm like, okay, like prickly competitive feeling. I know that, you've been trained to show up in these moments. What's behind that feeling? And it's almost always sort of admiration or curiosity or a desire to connect. It's almost always a good feeling underneath it. So I love that you brought that up. And I think that is really the essence of the climate movement, right? Like there is this just greater good that we're moving towards. So I loved your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I find that moral clarity is just like such a beautiful thing, because if you have a sense of what's right to do, you can just sort of live in that sense, and it's so clear that nothing else is as important, there are still going to be tensions, right, with one's personal life and one's family life and partners and so forth. Yeah, but sort of fundamentally one's own insecurities and difficulties are greatly diminished. It's just clear that they don't really matter that much.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into this in later questions and sort of dive into this more. But that's what I meant by that. Your essay upended my life, because it's really I've said this before. Like in a way, it makes everything in a way very simple, because you just wake up and you know exactly what you're fighting for and why it matters and why you can't do anything else, which makes my commercial work it has to end, which is okay. but yeah, that sort of moral clarity, at least for me, at least once I had it, and once I saw the problem and how urgent the task was, it sort of dissolves all of the other sort of internal conflicts, and you know, so yes. Your essay definitely like awakened that in me in a very real way. So the next question is, again, touching upon your essay. So in my own work, in my artwork, I'm often trying to connect to a nature that feels primordial. And I sometimes, in meditation or out in nature, or when I'm in flow doing art, I feel like I catch glimpses of that which is outside of sort of human understanding, like these vast geological stretches of time that make our time on Earth feel really, really short. And you connect to this vastness in a way that really puts this moment of ecological collapse into perspective. And you do that in your essay by writing about the previous 5 extinctions and comparing this time to other geological time periods. And I was wondering if you could talk about this, and also why you chose to broaden the lens of time in your essay.
I'll hit the latter first because I don't know. I mean, it's when I write things, I rewrite a lot, but I don't map things out. So it's not like I have a specific goal when I choose, a certain path. It's more that I choose the path, and then if it doesn't work, I, try to make another one. In terms of my ability to look at that, it came, I think, in part, at least, I mean, obviously everybody has that ability sometimes, right? You look at the stars, and that's what most people feel, is just how small we are. And that sense of wonder in certain places in nature. But in terms of intellectually, I think it was also helpful to read The Sixth Extinction, the Betsy Colbert book. And also there's a book by Bill Bryson, of all people, called A Short History of Nearly Everything. That when I gave it to a friend of mine after I loved it so much, he described it as a religious experience, which I thought was quite funny, but I understood what he meant, because it takes a very, very long view on nearly everything, as it says. And it's just a really wonderful perspective shifter. And in terms of climate change, it's just, sometimes like we have to back up and take the long view, right? Because we know that what's coming is much more dreadful than what has already happened, and so, sometimes in order to feel the sense of the continuity of life, and the resilience of the world, you got to back way the hell up, and say, like, with or without human beings, this world will go on and survive. And the odds that we're going to take out all life are really very, very small. And, so, I mean, that's not a place, if you back way the hell up, you also think that what we do doesn't matter. And so, like, I don't live in that place of being that far backed up, but I do think it's important to sometimes use that lens and understand sort of what this might look like. And also just to think of, like what we do now to fight climate change and to mitigate, the damage, might determine whether this is a problem of centuries, or a millennia or two, or of many, 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 many millennia, right? In terms of how long it takes the life on Earth to bounce back. And the difference between those two things is tremendous, and the suffering involved is tremendous. It's really almost incalculable and unimaginable. But that's why I made the comment that, that I sort of came up with the metaphor of, being on the other side of the birth canal, and imagining what will make it through, in fact, because we know we'll lose a mind-boggling and terrible amount, but that doesn't mean it's not worth saving the things that we save, so.
Yeah, your answer is so beautiful. I almost want to sit with it for a moment. I think that something that your essay gave me, and I say this often, is that this is a terrible, we're living in magnificent and terrible times. And what a gift, I use your words a lot, that it's a gift to be alive right now. And it is something that shocks me awake at night. but it also gives me, more so than anything else probably ever could in like the history of humanity, a very crystal clear purpose to be working towards. So yeah, I mean, this whole piece is about that. Like it really touched me profoundly and spoke. It put to words and sort of made real, sort of all encompassing, but for me, until that point, not quite crystallized feelings. So yeah, I clearly love the passage.
Thank
So Clarissa Pinkola Estes, she wrote in her book, Women Who Run with Wolves, that, quote, to love means to embrace and at the same time withstand many endings and many, many beginnings, all in the same relationship. And I chose this quote because it so beautifully captures how I feel about the word hope when it's used about the planetary crisis. And like myself, I'm not working from a space of hope. I'm working rather from a space of love. And that is a really deep rooted and stable footing. Whereas, there's days when I feel hopeful and there's days when I feel despair. So I would never sort of hinge myself on hope, but rooting myself in love feels like the way to go. And you write about love in your essay as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit to how love guides your climate activism.
Well, I think it's everything really. Yeah, I mean, the feeling of connection with other human beings, with nature, with animals, that is love, right? And love is not just a feeling, it's an action, and it's a way of being in the world. And I think the thing about hope and despair is that they are feelings. And feelings by their nature are, as I said in the essay, nearsighted, right? If you're feeling optimistic, you think things are going to work out okay. And if you're feeling, despair, you think everything is going to hell. And like neither of those things is necessarily true at all. And there is still some wiggle room for us to change what is true, right? And so we start to conflate probability with possibility when we're sitting in those kinds of feelings, and if we only did things that we thought were probably going to work, we'd never do anything difficult or hard, or we'd never, if the abolitionists or enslaved people had only thought, that it was probable that slavery was going to end and so forth, yeah, it wouldn't have happened when it happened, right? And so long odds shouldn't scare us. And if we're rooted in working in love, then they don't scare us, because it's not about whether we win or not, quote unquote. It's not about, whether our personal efforts are worthwhile. It doesn't matter whether my personal efforts ever make a clear difference to much of anything, because maybe one of the things that happens is that somebody who's eventually going to make a big difference read something that I wrote that matters to them. You know what I mean? It doesn't, we're never going to know what our impacts are. All we can know is that people together working for the common good can absolutely have tremendous impacts. And so we have to be willing, to act out of love and humility, and also to work with other people out of love and humility. And it won't always be easy by any stretch of the imagination. And I think if the times when it gets hard are not so much when we see the dangers, I think the times when it gets hard is when we flag so much emotionally, and we're just feeling so drained emotionally, that the sense of connection and love that we have for the world only emerges as grief, right? And that grief is important. Like, we're all going to feel it sometimes. So the question is, like, I think, and it connects to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the lens and the length of the time period you're looking at, because they're, like the easiest example of that is parents, right? They may think that they're useless against the climate crisis, but if they understand what their kids and or grandkids are up against and how much less of a chance they will have to make a difference, right? So anybody, who's 50 has vastly more chance, because they're acting as adult agents right now, than anybody who's 5, and so, if you understand that you may have a very small chance of making a difference, but your child will have even less of a chance, and you want them to have a decent life, then of course you're going to overcome, your own feeling that you don't have much agency, in order to take whatever agency you can for the sake of those you love who are still coming up in the world, and I don't think, I do not have children, and I definitely don't think that people who have children love the world better or more than those who don't. But for a lot of people, that is the thing that nudges them in, and that shifts their sense of, whether they need to actually engage with this crisis or not.
Yeah. I have a 6-year-old, and to say it's hard. I think the hardest thing about being a parent, no, that's not true. There's a million things that are hard about being a parent. That's another garden meeting. But one of the things is that, like, all children's books, all stories, everything is grounded and based in the natural world. And it's like he's slowly realizing that the world that's sort of been promised to him in imagination is so rapidly disappearing, if not gone, and that's really heartbreaking to see. But on the other side, he's like active. I mean, he's also, hanging out with me all day long, but he's also, very actively imagining a new way that the world could be, right? Like without cars. And he notices, I remember being a kid and noticing air pollution and having it bother me, but like not seeing any other way possible. Like it just, like, I just took it as part of life. And I think he doesn't. He's sort of like, wouldn't, like, let's get rid of these cars, let's make the air smell better. So that's one thing that's nice. He's really actively imagining together with me something new. But yeah, it's that intergenerational responsibility is a lot. But I also have a lot of parents that don't feel it. It's interesting. I don't have a question prepared about this, but I'm just going to say it, is that something that I find navigating the world these days that's tricky, is that I really feel the urgency. And sometimes, like, I'll say something and someone's like, oh, and I kind of like glaze over, and I notice that they're clearly not feeling it. And that's, it makes me really grateful for spaces like this and for friends that are also in the movement. Yeah.
By having those conversations 15, 20 years ago, it was, yeah. And it's, and makes you feel a little crazy, because even though you're virtually certain right, and you want to be wrong, the fact that the world is so clearly just going on its daily business, is really unsettling.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So the next question is that you wrote in your essay that the word sacrament comes from the Latin word solemn oath. And it was used by early Christians, interestingly, as the translation of the Greek word for mystery. And that this work is in its deepest sense both a solemn oath and a mystery. It is a sacrament. We are walking into great darkness, and the light that guides us must come from within. End quote. And I was wondering if you could talk to me about what this inner light means to you, and how you see that it can guide us in this time of great darkness.
I thought about that a little bit when you sent me the questions, and the truth is, I'm not sure that light is the right metaphor, and it's more, it is, it's the right metaphor maybe, but it's about what's internal and not what I see, what I really see. It's not about a specific vision for me. Somebody asked me the other day sort of, what my hopeful vision of the world is. And, and I said, to be honest, I don't really have one. It's not very well fleshed out anyway. There are all kinds of things like your son that I can imagine, right? And certainly I can imagine, carless cities and everybody walking and biking to work and public transit and all that. And that's a huge part of it, right? But there's a million changes that'll need to happen. And I don't really spend my time in the specificity of like that vision, although I really admire the people who can begin to do that. Like I love the videos that Naomi Klein made with or Ocasio-Cortez. And I think it's really important that people begin to see those kinds of things and understand how the right shifts might happen. But for me, it's more, I guess, about just a feeling of moral compass and imaginary compass, imagination, the compass of the imagination, guiding me towards something that feels like, truth, reality, hope, whatever you want to call it. That is, whether you think we have, a 30% chance of surviving with civilization more or less recognizably intact, or whether you think we've got a 1/30% chance or less than that, or whatever that thing is that we're imagining that might be a human relationship of harmony and sustainability with the world around us and with one another. It is obviously a tremendous shift from where we are now, right? And not just in terms of our relationship to nature, but also in terms of our relationship to one another, and how we build our societies and our children's psyches and so forth. And so, yeah, it's just about sort of that little glimmer, that little light that sort of says, this thing of beauty may not be probable, but it is possible. And so, like, sit with that small spark and let it, guide you when there's a lot of darkness. And when I moved to Seattle from Portland about 15 years ago, I moved for a relationship that broke up shortly thereafter. And then my dog was diagnosed with cancer and died quite young. And it was just a really hard time for me because I was feeling very isolated. And I also sort of out of the blue shifted from being mostly a fiction writer, almost exclusively a fiction writer, to being almost exclusively a poet. And I really had no idea what I was doing at all. And so, and what I told people once I sort of was in that place for a while was, I feel like I'm sailing into the fog. I don't have any idea where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing at all. All I know is this feels right. And I'm going to keep moving forward in this way because it feels like the right thing for me to do. And, so that's how I feel. That's what I feel humanity is doing right now. Right. And so all we can do is sort of hold within us a vision of what it might be like, or not a vision. I mean, again, that implies more detail, I think, than there for me, but just a sense, maybe that's for me what hope is just that little tiny sense of possibility, that little tiny sense of this is what's good. And so I'm going to move towards what's good and moral and gives other human beings and other living creatures the best possibility of thriving, to move towards the thriving.
I love that. To move towards the thriving and the compass of the imagination are both beautiful terms that you just came up with. And I really resonated with the words, and I see what you mean, that it's not a light, it's more sort of like a feeling, or almost sort of like a current that you're following. Something that's happened for me this year is that I mean, I've also been reading Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell, and revisiting the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and being really interested about sort of dropping into my body and into my intuition, and connecting with that sort of the sacred inside of myself, which is then extended out and is the sacred that's all around me. And I feel like that is just, for me, navigating this space that is really wrought with a lot of grief and uncertainty. It's almost like this endless wellspring, right? I feel like I'm like really sort of dipping my cup into that life force. And another thing that's been really helpful with is disengaging with the way that I've normally operated, which is very disconnected from my own sacredness or my own place within nature. And as instead, of course, like a capitalist consumer society is very sort of built on these external sort of posts that you're supposed to hit, right? And Sherry Mitchell has this great metaphor of the dance of the cannibal giant. I mean, I definitely danced that dance for a long time. And I think that the disconnecting from the dance was coming back into that place inside of me. And that's what for myself, my interpretation of that text was like, oh, right, it's sort of the guideposts to find are really inside of all of us in those quiet moments. Yeah.
There's a wonderful Emily Dickinson line that I absolutely love. I think it was in a letter of hers rather than in a poem, but she said something about the sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can, you know? And so it's a question about what is our needle? You know, what is our compass? You know?
Yeah. Beautiful. So actually this is related to the next question, which is for yourself, how do you practice self-care, and how do you fill your cup, and how do you give yourself the regenerative rest or whatever it is that you need to come back day after day and do the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a complicated question because I have, you know, there are some specific things day to day that help keep me together. And the main one of which is running. I live near a beautiful park and I'm able to run in it every morning. And that, you know, definitely is the single most important thing in terms of, I mean, other than obviously, you know, relationships and like eating right and things like that. You know, and for me also the question of it is, I have a vexed relationship with the question of burnout and self-care, because for me, burnout comes more often when the work isn't going well for one reason or another, rather than when I'm working a lot. You know, so I can work, you know, for some period of time, at least I can work 60 hours a week, you know, for weeks or months on end, you know, if I'm in a sort of flow state, and, you know, I just sort of carve out the little time to walk my dog and take a run. And, you know, otherwise I can, you know, keep it together for a while like that. But, and in fact, I can thrive on that for a while. You know, lately, honestly, even with my life being as privileged as it is, the pandemic has definitely impacted my ability to feel sort of inspired. And I've been feeling particularly guilty about that, because I mean, when your work matters as much to you as my work matters to me, the idea of phoning it in is pretty horrible, right? And there have been some weeks and maybe months when I have felt that over the last year. And, you know, just like, yeah, what are we really doing? What should we be doing? I don't know. And I don't have the energy to like do good thinking on this right now. You know, it's really amazed me. I have one friend who said, you know, she was spending the pandemic and she was working on 3 different books and doing all this and that. And I'm like, oh, come on, how can you? I'm like,
I would just say to that, first off, you're incredible. And even just from having done the work that you've done and put it out into the world, like your ripples are going out, even you can stand completely still and the ripples you put out into the world are changing it every day. Like I'm a ripple. You really changed my life. So I think
we all need to keep rippling though. We all need to keep rippling.
We can of course keep rippling, but I would just say, I mean, yeah, just I don't know, we don't know each other, but I would say just the pandemic has been really hard. And I think that sort of seeing this sort of like one take on the pandemic is like, you have so much free time. Like, why don't you write a book? I mean, I didn't feel that way at all. I was like, this is what? Like, you know, I think that the idea that that one should be hyper productive during like kind of a global tragedy is, I mean, and on one hand, like quite American, but
very capitalist.
with our jobs, you're like, oh, it's a pandemic, let's use it as a ladder. Like, I don't know. So yeah, but um, yeah, I completely understand that feeling, and I think that that it's a natural time to be feeling it. I mean, what a bizarre year we've had. I don't know. I think I went and got my vaccine, and my doctor, she's just like, you know, in German, she's just like, what a year we've had, Frau Bösch. And I was like, it was almost like no one ever says it, sort of like, what have we just been through? It's been rough,
Right.
you know, and it was just a small acknowledgement. And I sort of felt it for the first time. So I think that our nature as humans is just to constantly adapt, but we've really been through something. So I would just say for all of us to be gentle and kind if we didn't, you know, write the book.
Oh, yeah, totally. And yeah, you know, and partly it's a bit of a selfish American thing too, right? But wanting to feel inspired and the sense of like, do you need to be inspired to do the work? You know, no, not for some period of time anyway, you know, but it certainly does help when you get the wind in your sails, you know, because either good things are happening or because you just feel like you're in the right place doing the right thing, and those feelings will come and go, you know. And so in terms of like what we can do to help uh, to, to help us be open to feeling them, I think has a lot to do with relationship. It has a lot to do with, you know, ability to get out into nature and sometimes, yeah, totally giving yourself a break for whether it's 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever, to just refresh your own sense of perspective and come back in fighting shape, you know.
I mean, something that I find actually really quite liberating about being in Germany is the thing that people complain about is that everyone's always in a bad mood and they're quite dour. But at the same time, I remember learning German, and the first thing you learn is like, hey, how are you? And the German answers in the textbook are always like, oh, you know, it's okay, or like, going. And everyone in the class is like, what's wrong with this book? And they're like, no, these are normal German answers. Because like, how many days are you really being fantastic?
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's such a, I mean, I think they have a much more honest expectation as to how you're supposed to feel every day, and the highs just aren't always high. And
Right.
and this is quite personal, but I'll share it because I was with my therapist one day, and I was sort of like having this, you know, like I'm supposed to, you know, be a mother and a friend and a daughter and you know, all these roles that I had to fill. Basically, I was feeling really like, you know, burdened by it. And then by the end, I was like, and on top of it all, I have to be happy. She just started laughing. She's like, that is the most American thing.
Yeah, you know, I'll tell you a funny story. Swedes are the same. I mean, I think most cultures are the same, right?
Yeah.
More than Americans. But one time, some Swedish, we were traveling with some elderly Swedish friends, my sister and I, and we were at the Grand Canyon, and the waitress put a little smiley face on the bottom of the restaurant tab, and the elderly couple and their daughter, they passed it around because they were just like, oh look, like isn't that odd and charming? You know, like why is there a smiley face on the restaurant tab? You know, and it was the first time. I mean, yeah, of course, the smiley face in the restaurant tab wouldn't have made any impression on me whatsoever, but to them it was quite foreign, you know.
Yeah.
And I thought that they would maybe like mock it or think it was a bit ridiculous or something, but no, they were actually thought it was nice. You know, they were like, oh, this Americans basically that's interesting and maybe it's a good thing, you know.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I miss the American sort of superficial happiness on a day-to-day basis. But I would say that especially when going through a global pandemic, that it's a bit liberating to not have to sort of always feel inspired and always feel happiness. And I think something that's also been like sort of eye-opening for me in Germany, they're like, well, is the point of life to be happy? And I'm like,
totally.
you know, and I think that that's sort of like this new, it was sort of flipping it, like maybe the point of life is something else, right? Like maybe it's sort of having a role in a community or just sort of other ways of thinking about it. Yeah, that was, let me see, if anyone in the audience has any questions, they can go ahead and type them in. And my closing question for you, I have two. I have one that's a bit selfish. It's for me. I'll ask the non-selfish one first. So the non-selfish one for everyone is, do you have any advice or calls to action to give to the audience or to others listening?
You know, only to engage in your communities in ways that make systemic change, and for if somebody's near a pipeline that's trying to get built, I think they should show up for the folks who are fighting that, or become the folks who are fighting that. It could be fighting for good policies around solar and wind in different communities. I mean, there are a million different ways of engaging that matter. Certainly regenerative agriculture matters, all kinds of things matter, but but more than anything, make, to the degree that it's possible in your life, try to make system change. Don't just try to make sort of personal choices, because if we wait for everybody in the world to make personal choices and to even have those personal choices, which are often a sign of privilege or of living in the right place, or whatever, the place where you can opt in to renewable energy as opposed to places that don't even have it available or whatever. We need to make those options available to everybody, and we need to make them the default for everybody. And we need to make it really clear in every election, but especially those 2022 elections, of course, that being anything other than bold and visionary on climate is absolutely unacceptable at this point in time, because we have so little time left in which to make a significant enough difference to really give good portions of the globe, if not all of them, a chance at being ecologically stable and therefore sociologically stable. We really have to act very, very, very fast.
I'll tell you that yeah, your words have changed my life. And also your essay was I read the book by myself, and it was during the reading feel, right after reading your essay, that I realized that I needed to read the book with a community. And I started a book circle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was this, I was like, I cannot continue on my own. And because of that experience, I have such a beautiful circle. We still meet once a week. So you also brought that into my life. So thank you.
Good. I'm very, very glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire. I've really enjoyed this.